Alright, Karina baby, for our year full of stories, here's the 6th that we're going to be reading. It's Marching Socks. Or is it marching or matching? Matching socks. Sort these socks in pairs, the zebras and bears, the spots and the stripes, the red, greens, and whites, the longs and the shorts, the thick ones for sports. Put the patterns and plain back together again. Match each sock here so they're ready to wear. Oh. So that's matching socks. Can you see some of the matches? This one goes with this one. 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 See all the matches that they have? They're all matching socks. This one matches. This one matches. This one matches. This one matches. These ones match. And those ones match. Lots of matching socks. How many pairs of matching socks do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We have 12 pairs of matching socks. All right, baby cakes. Let's find out what our next story is in our storybook. Yesterday we read Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Today is the story of Aladdin, or the Wonderful Lamp. There lived in ancient times in the capital of China a tailor named Mustafa, who was so poor that he could scantily support his wife and son. Now his son, whose name was Aladdin, was idle and careless and disobedient to his father and his mother, and he played from morning till night in the streets with other bad and idle lads. His father was so much troubled that he became ill and died in a few months. As Aladdin was one day playing with his vagabond associates, a stranger passing by stood and regarded him earnestly. This stranger was a sorcerer, an African magician. Taking Aladdin aside from his companions, he said, "Boy, is not thy father Mustafa, the tailor?" "Yes," answered the boy, "but he is now dead." At these words, the African magician kissed him and cried, "I am thine uncle. I have been abroad for many years, and now I am coming home." Then he gave him a small handful of money, saying, "Go, O my son, to thy mother, and tell her that I will visit her tomorrow." As soon as the African magician had departed, Aladdin ran to his mother, overjoyed. "Mother," he said, "I have met my uncle." "No, my son," answered his mother, "thou hast no uncle by thy father's side or mine." Then Aladdin related to her all that the African magician had told him. The next day Aladdin's mother made ready a respite. And when night came, the African magician entered, laden with wine and various fruits. He saluted Aladdin's mother and shed tears and lamentation that he had not arrived in time to see his brother Mustafa. "I have been 40 years absent from my country," said the wily magician, "traveling in the Indies, Persia, Arabia, Siberia, and Egypt." Then he turned to Aladdin and asked him what trade or occupation he had chosen. At this question, Aladdin hung his head, blushing and ashamed, while his mother replied that he was an idle fellow, living on the streets. "That is not well," said the magician. "If thou hast no desire to learn a handicraft, I will take a shop for thee, and furnish it with fine linens and fine stuffs. Aladdin's mother, who had not till then believed the magician was the brother of her husband, now could no longer doubt. She thanked him for his kindness to Aladdin. The next day the African magician came again and took Aladdin to a merchant, who provided the lad with a rich and handsome suit. After which the magician took him to visit the principal shops, where they sold the richest stuffs and linens. He showed him also the largest and finest musqua, the entrance from he and entertained him at the most frequented inns. Then the magician escorted Aladdin to his mother, who, when she saw her son so magnificently attired, bestowed 1,000 blessings upon his benefactor. Aladdin rose early the next morning and dressed himself in the elegant new garments. Soon after this, the African magician entered the house and said, "Come, my dear son, and I will show you the fine things today." Then he led the lad out of the city, enticing him beyond the gardens across the country until they arrived at some mountains. He amused Aladdin all the way by relating to him pleasant stories and feasting him with cakes and fruits. When at last they arrived in the valley between the two mountains, a great height, the magician said to Aladdin, "Will you go no further? I will now show you these some extraordinary things. While I strike a light, do thou gather up those sticks for a fire." Aladdin collected a pile of sticks, and the African magician set fire to them. And when they began to burn, he muttered several magical words, and cast a perfume over the fire. Immediately a great smoke arose, and the earth trembled open, and uncovered a stone with a brass ring fixed in the middle. Aladdin became so frightened at what he saw that he would have run away, but the magician caught hold of him and gave him such a box on the ears that he knocked him down. Aladdin rose up trembling, with tears in his eyes, inquiring what he had done to merit such a punishment. "I have my reasons," answered the magician harshly. "Thou seest what I have just done." "But my son," continued he, softening, "know that under the stone is hidden a treasure designed to be thine. It will make thee richer than the greatest merchants in all the world. Fate decrees that no one but thou may lift the stone and enter the cave, but to do this successfully thou must promise to obey my instructions." Aladdin was amused, and said quickly, "Command me, uncle, for I promise to obey." The magician then directed him to take hold of the ring and lift the stone, and to pronounce at the time the name of his father and grandfather. Aladdin did as he was bidden, and raised the heavy stone with ease, and laid it on one side. When the stone was pulled up, there appeared a cave with steps to go further down. "Observe, my son," said the African magician, "what I direct. Descend, and at the bottom of the steps thou wilt find a door open. Beyond the door are 3 great halls. Tuck up the vast, and pass through them without stopping. Above all things, do not touch the walls, for if thou do so thou wilt die instantly. At the end of the 3rd hall there will be a door which opens into a garden planted with fine trees laden with fruits. Walk directly across the garden to the terrace, where thou wilt see a niche, and in the niche a lighted lamp. Take down the lamp, pour out the oil, and bring it to me. If thou shalt wish for any of the fruits in the garden, thou mustest gather as much as thou pleasest." The magician then took the ring from his finger and placed it upon Aladdin's hands. Tell him that it would preserve him from telling him that it would preserve him from all evil. Aladdin sprang into the cave, descended the steps, and found the 3 halls just as the African magician had described. He passed through, crossed the garden, took down the lamp from the niche, poured out the oil, and placed it on his bosom. But as he came down from the terrace, he stopped and observed the fruits. All the trees were loaded with extraordinary fruits of different colors. The whites were pearls, the clears were transparent diamonds, the red rubies and green emeralds, the blue turquoises, the purple amethyst, and those that were yellow sapphires. Aladdin was altogether ignorant of their worth, yet he was so pleased with the variety of bright colors of the seeming fruits that he gathered some of every sort. Aladdin then returned to the mouth of the cave, where the magician was, expecting him with the utmost impatience. Now the African magician intended, as soon as he should have received the lamp from Aladdin, to push the lad back into the cave, so that there should remain no witnesses of the affair. But Aladdin refused to give up the lamp until he was out of the cave. The magician, provoked at the refusal, flew into a rage, threw some incense into the fire, pronounced 2 magical words, and instantly the stone which has covered the mouth of the cave moved back into place. Then the African magician, having lost all hope for obtaining the wonderful lamp, returned that same day to Africa. When Aladdin found himself thus buried alive, he cried and called out to his uncle that he was ready to give him the lamp, but in vain, since his cries could not be heard. Then he sat down upon the steps without any hopes of ever seeing the light of day again. Aladdin remained in this state for 2 days without eating or drinking. On the 3rd day he clasped his hands in desire. He accidentally rubbed the ring which the magician had placed upon his finger. Immediately a genie of enormous size and frightful aspect rose out of the earth, his head reaching the roof of the cave, and said to him, "What wilt thou have? I will obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of all who may possess the ring on thy finger, I and the other slaves of that ring." Aladdin answered without hesitation, "Whoever thou art, deliver me from this place." He had no sooner spoken these words than he had found himself in that very spot where the magician had caused the earth to open. Thankfully to find himself safe, he quickly made his way home. When he reached his mother's door, the joy at seeing her and the weakness due to lack of food made him faint. His mother did all she could to bring him to himself, and the first words he spoke were, "Pray, mother, give me something to eat." His mother brought what she had and set it before him. Aladdin then related to his mother all that had happened to him, and showed her the transparent fruits of different colors which he had gathered in the garden. But though those fruits were precious stones, brilliant as the sun, the mother was ignorant of their worth, and she laid them carelessly aside. Aladdin slept very soundly till the next morning, but on waking, he found that there was nothing to eat in the house, nor any money with which to buy any food. "Alas, my son," said his mother, "I have not a bit of bread to give thee, but I have a little cotton, which I have spun, and I will go and sell it." Mother replied, "Aladdin, keep thy cotton for another time, and give me the lamp I brought home with me yesterday. I will go and sell it." Aladdin's mother brought the lamp, and as it was very dirty, she took some fine sand and water to clean it. But she no sooner began to rub than the instant a hideous genie of gigantic size appeared before her, and she said in a voice like thunder, "What willest thou have? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slaves of all those who hold the lamp in their hands. I and the other slaves of the lamp. Aladdin's mother, terrified at the sight of the genie, fainted, but Aladdin snatched up the lamp out of her hand and said to him, I am hungry. Bring me something to eat. The genie disappeared immediately and in an instant returned with a large silver tray holding 12 covered dishes and the same metal, which contained the most delicious viands, viands, vines, 6 large white breads, cakes, 2 figs of wine, and 2 silver cups, 2 flagons of wine, and 2 silver cups. All these he placed upon the carpet and disappeared. Aladdin fetched some water and sprinkled it on his mother's face, and she recovered. But with her surprise to see the dishes and to smell the savory odors which exhaled from them. When, however, Aladdin informed her that they were brought by the genie whom she had seen, she was greatly alarmed, and urged him to sell the enchanted lamp and have nothing to do with the genie. With thy leave, mother, answered Aladdin, I will keep the lamp, and it has been of service to us. Let us make profitable use of it without exchanging the envy and jealousy of our neighbors. However, since the genie frightened thee, I will take the lamp out of thy sight and put it where I may find it when I want it. His mother, convinced by his arguments, said he might do as he wished, but for himself she would have nothing to do with the genie. The mother and son then sat down with breakfast, and they found that they had enough food left for dinner and supper, and also for 2 meals for the next day. By the following night they had eaten all the provisions the genie had brought, and the next day Aladdin, putting on one of the silver dishes under his vest, went to the silver market and sold it. Before returning home, he called at the baker's and brought bread, and on his return gave the rest of the money to his mother, who went and purchased provisions enough to last for some time. After this manner they lived, till Aladdin had sold all the dishes of the silver tray. When the money was spent, he had recourse again to the lamp. He took it in his hand and rubbed it, and immediately the genie appeared and said, What willest thou have? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of those who hold the lamp in their hands. I and the other slaves of the lamp. I am hungry, said Aladdin. Bring me something to eat. The genie immediately disappeared and instantly returned with a tray covered with the same number of dishes as before. And he set them down and vanished. And when the provisions were gone, Aladdin sold the tray and the dishes as before. Thus he and his mother continued to live for some time, and though they had an inexhaustible treasure in their lamp, they dwelt quietly with frugality. Meanwhile, by his acquaintances among the jewelers, Aladdin came to know the fruits which he had gathered in the subterranean garden, instead of being colored glass, were jewels of immeasurable value. One day Aladdin heard the others proclaim, commanding the people to close their shops and houses to keep within doors, while the Princess Badroulbadour, the Sultan's daughter, was to the baths and returned. Aladdin became filled with curiosity to see the face of the princess, so he placed himself behind the outer door of the bath, which was so situated that he could not fail to see her. He had not long to wait before the princess came, and he could see her plainly through the chink in the door without being discovered. She was attended by a great crowd of ladies and slaves, and in niches, who walked on each side of her and behind her. When she came near to the door of the bath, she took off her veil, and Aladdin saw her face. She was the most beautiful young woman in the world, and Aladdin became filled with admiration and love. After the princess had passed by, Aladdin returned home in a state of great dejection, which he could not conceal from his mother. She inquired the cause, and Aladdin told her all that had occurred, saying that saying this my mother is the cause of my melancholy. I love the princess more than I can express. I cannot live without the beautiful Babrul Buldil, and I am resolved to ask her in marriage of the Sultan her father. Aladdin's mother burst into a loud laugh. Alas, my son, said she, what else thou thinking of? Thou must be mad to think this. I assure thee, my mother, replied Aladdin, that I am not mad, but I am resolved to demand the princess in marriage, and I will expect thee to use thy provisions with the Sultan. I go to the Sultan? Answered his mother, amused and surprised. I assure thee I cannot undertake such an errand. And who art thou, my son? Continued she, to think that the Sultan's daughter? Hast thou forgotten that thy father was one of the poorest tailors in the city? How can I open my mouth in his majestic presence, and the leisure of his court would confound me? Besides, no one ever asks a favor of the Sultan without taking him a fitting present. Aladdin replied, would not those fruits that I brought home from the subterranean garden make an acceptable present? For what thou and I took from colored glass are really jewels of immense value, and I am persuaded that they will be favorably received by the Sultan. Thou hast a large porcelain dish fit to hold them. Fetch it. Large porcelain dish fit to hold them. Fetch it, and let us see how the stones will look when we have arranged them accordingly to their different colors. Aladdin's mother brought the porcelain dish, and he arranged the jewels on it according to his fancy. The next morning, Aladdin's mother took the porcelain dish in which were the jewels and set out for the Sultan's palace. She entered the audience chamber and placed herself just before the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, at the great lord of the court, who sat in council, but she did not venture to declare her business, and when the audience chamber closed for the day, she returned home. The next morning she again repaired to the audience chamber, and left it when it closed without having dared to address the Sultan. And she continued to do this daily, until at last one morning the chief officer of the court approached her, and at a sign from him she followed him to the Sultan's throne, where he left her. Aladdin's mother saluted the Sultan, and he said to her, my good woman, I have observed thee for a long time. What business brings thee hither? Aladdin's mother told him about Aladdin's love for the princess, and she ended by formally demanding the princess in marriage for her son, after which she took the porcelain dish and presented it to the Sultan. The Sultan's amazement and surprise were inexpressible when he saw so many large, beautiful, and valuable jewels. After he had admired and handled all the jewels one by one, he turned to the Grand Vizier and said, What sayest thou to such a present? Is it not worthy of the princess, my daughter? Those words agitated the great vizier, for the Sultan had intended to bestow the princess, his daughter, upon the vizier's son. Therefore the vizier whispered in his ears and said, I cannot but own that the princess is worthy of the prince, but I beg thee to grant me 3 months' delay, and before the end of that time I hope that my son may be able to make a nobler present than Aladdin, who is an entire stranger to thy majesty." The Sultan granted his request and turned to Aladdin's mother, said to her, "Good woman, my good woman, go home and tell thy son that I agree to the proposal thou hast made me, but that I cannot marry the princess my daughter until the end of 3 months. At the expansion of that time come again." Aladdin's mother, overjoyed with the words, hastened home and informed Aladdin of what the Sultan had said. Aladdin thought himself the most happy of all men at hearing this news. When 2 months out of the 3 months went past, his mother, one evening, finding no oil in the house, went out to purchase some. She found in the city general rejoicing. The shops were decorated, the streets were covered. Aladdin's mother asked the oil merchant what was the meaning of all this festivity. He answered, "Tonight the Grand Vizier's son is to marry the princess Badrul Badour, the Sultan's daughter." Aladdin's mother hastened home and related the news to Aladdin. He was thunderstruck on hearing the words, and hastened to his chamber, closed the door, took the lamp in his hand, rubbed it in the same place as before, and immediately the genie appeared. "Genie," said Aladdin, "I have determined the Princess Bedtime in marriage of the Sultan, her father. He promised her to me, only requiring 3 months' delay. But instead of keeping his word, he has this night married her to the Grand Vizier's son. What I require of thee is this: as soon as the bride and bridegroom are alone, bring them both hither." "Master," said the genie, "I hear and I obey." The genie then disappeared, flew to the palace, took up the bed with the bride and the bridegroom in it, returned, and set it down in Aladdin's room. The genie then took up the bridegroom, who was trembling with fear, and shut him up in the dark closet. Aladdin approached the princess and said most respectfully, "Admirable princess, thou art here in safety. The Sultan thy father promised thee in marriage to me, and as he has now broken his word, I am thou forced to carry thee away. I order to prevent thy marriage with the Grand Vizier's son. Sleep in place until morning, when I will restore thee to the Sultan thy father." Having thus reassured the princess, Aladdin laid himself down and slept until morning. Aladdin had no occasion the next morning to summon the genie, who appeared at the hour appointed. He brought the bridegroom from the closet, and placing him beside the princess, transported the bed to the royal palace. The bridegroom, pale and trembling with fear, sought the Sultan, related to him all that had happened, and implored him to break off his marriage with the princess. The Sultan did so, and commanded all rejoicing to cease. Aladdin waited until 3 months were complete, and the next day sent his mother to the palace to remind the Sultan of his promise. The Sultan no sooner saw her than he remembered his business, and as he did not wish to give his daughter to a stranger, thought to put her off by a request impersonable of fulfillment. "My good woman," he said, "it is true that sultans should keep their promises, and I am willing to do so as soon as thy son shall send me 40 trays of massy gold, filled full of the same sort of jewels thou hast already made me a present of. The trays must be carried by a like number of black slaves, who shall be led by as many young and handsome white slaves, magnificently dressed." Aladdin's mother hastened home, laughing within herself at her son's foolish admiration. She then gave him an exact account of what the Sultan had said to her, and the conditions on which he consented to the marriage. Aladdin immediately returned to his room, took the lamp, and rubbed it. The genie appeared, and with the usual salutation offered his services. "Genie," said Aladdin, as he described the Sultan's wishes, "go and fetch me this present as soon as possible." Did I show you the other picture, baby? Look, here's the genie and Aladdin when he was little. In a short time, the genie returned with 40 black slaves, each bearing upon its head a heavy tray of pure gold, filled of pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and every sort of precious stone, all larger and more beautiful than those already presented to the Sultan. These, together with the white slaves, quite filled the house. Aladdin found his mother in great amusement at seeing so many people and such vast riches. Mother, he said, I would have you return to the palace with this present as a dowry, that the Sultan may judge by the rapidity with which I fulfilled his demands of the ardent and secure love I have for the princess's daughter. The possessions of slaves and the humble mother proceeded through the streets, and the people ran together to see the extraordinary and magnificent spectacle. At length they arrived at the Sultan's palace, and the first slave, followed by the rest, advanced into the audience chamber, where the Sultan was seated on his throne, surrounded by the vizier and the chief officers of the courts. Aladdin's mother advanced to the foot of the throne and presented herself before the Sultan. When he cast his eyes upon the 40 trays filled with the most precious and brilliant jewels, and gazed upon the foreclosure slaves in so richly attired, he no longer hesitated. As the sight of such immense riches and Aladdin's quickness in satisfying his demands easily procured him that the young man would make a most desirable son-in-law. Therefore he said to Aladdin's mother, Go and tell thy son that I wait with open arms to embrace him. Aladdin's mother hastened home and informed his son of the joyful news. He, enraptured at the prospect of his marriage with the princess, returned to his chamber again, rubbed the lamp, and the obedient genie appeared as before. The genie said, Aladdin, provide me with the richest and most magnificent raiment ever worn by a king, and with a charger that surpasses in beauty and the best of the Sultan's stables, with a saddle, bridle, and the other capstans worth 1,000,000 of gold pieces. I want also 20 slaves richly clothed to walk by my side and follow me, and 20 more to go before me in 2 ranks. Besides these, bring my mother 6 female slaves to attend her as richly dressed as any of the princesses Babul Baldors, each carrying a dress fit for the Sultan's wife. I want also 10,000 pieces of gold in 10 purses. Go and make haste. The genie presented all these to Aladdin and disappeared. Of course, the 10 purses Aladdin took 4, which he gave to his mother, and other 6 he left in the hands of the slaves, who brought them with an order to throw the gold and handfuls by handfuls amongst the people as they went to the Sultan's palace. The 6 slaves who carried the purses he ordered likewise to march before him, 3 on one side, on the right hand, and 3 on the left. Aladdin then clad himself in his new garments and mounted his charger, began the march to the Sultan's castle. The streets, though which he passed, were intensely filled with a vast concourse of people, who rent the air with their accumulation. When he arrived at the palace, everything was prepared for his reception. The marriage feast was begun, and then Sultan ordered that the contract of marriage between the Princess Bartholomew and Aladdin should be immediately drawn up. Then he asked Aladdin if he wished the celebration solemnized that day, to which Aladdin answered, Thou'rt great in my impatience. I beg leave the defer I beg leave to defer it until I have built a palace before fit for to receive the princess. Therefore I pray thee give me a spot of ground near thy palace where I may build. My son, said the Sultan, take what ground thou thinkest proper. And he embraced Aladdin, who took his leave with as many politeness as though he had always lived at court. Also, as soon as Aladdin reached home, he dismounted, returned to his own chamber, took the lamp, and called the genie as before. The genie said to Aladdin, I would have thee build me as soon as possible a palace near the Sultan's fit to receive my wife, the Princess Babrul Bardor. Build it of prospery, jasper, lapis, lazuli, or the finest materials of various colors. On the terraced roof build me a large hall, crowned with a dome. Let the walls be of mossy gold and silver. On each of the 4 sides of the hall let there be 6 windows. Leave one window laced unfinished, but enrich all the others with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. I have had also a spacious garden. Okay. A spacious garden and treasures filled of gold and silver. There must be kitchens, offices, storehouses, and stables full with the finest horses. I want also male and female slaves, and quarters and grooms. Come and tell me when it is all finished. The next morning before break of day, the genie presented himself to Aladdin and said, Master, thy palace is finished. Come and see it if it pleases thee. Aladdin had no sooner signified his consent than the genie transported him thither in an instant, and led him through richly furnished apartments. And Aladdin found nothing but what was magnificent. Genie, he said, there is also one thing wanting, which I forgot to mention. That is a carpet of fine velvet for the princess to walk upon before my palace to the Sultan's. The genie disappeared, and instantly a carpet of fine velvet stretched across the park to the door of the Sultan's palace. Aladdin's mother, dressed in her most sumptuous garments, and attended by 6 female slaves who were clad richly and magnificently, went in steadily processions across the park. She was received at the palace with great honor, and the Sultan immediately ordered bands to play. In the joyous city, the merchants began to adorn their ships and houses with fine carpets and silks, and to prepare illuminants for the coming festival. When night arrived, the princess took the tender leave of her father, and accompanied by Aladdin's mother, set out across the velvet carpet, amid the sound of trumpets and lighted by 1,000 torches. Aladdin received her with joy and led her into a large illuminated hall, where was spread a magnificent repast. The next morning, Aladdin mounted and went to the midst of a large troop of slaves and the Sultan's palace. The Sultan received him with honors, and Aladdin then said, I entreated thee to partake of a repast in the princess's palace, attended by the Grand Vizier and thy court. The Sultan consented with pleasure, and followed by all the lords of the court accompanied Aladdin. The nearer the Sultan approached Aladdin's palace, the more he was struck with its beauty. But when he came into the hall of the 40 windows enriched with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and all large and perfect stones, he was so much surprised that he remained for some time motionless. "The palace," exclaimed he, "is surely one of the wonders of the world." The Sultan examined and admired all the windows, but on counting them he found that there were but 23, also richly adorned, but that the 24th was left imperfect. And in great astonishment he inquired the reason of this. "It was by my orders that the workmen left it thus," said Aladdin, "since I wish that thou shalt have the glory of finishing the hall." The Sultan, much pleased with this, complimented and immediately ordered his jewelers and goldsmiths to complete the 40th and 20th window. The jewelers worked steadily for a whole month, but could not finish half the window, although they used all the jewels the Sultan had and borrowed from the vizier. Aladdin, who knew that all the Sultan's endeavors to complete the window were in vain, sent for the jewelers and goldsmiths, and commanded that they not only to desist, but to undo the work they had done, and to return the jewels to the Sultan and to the Grand Vizier. They undid it a few hours when they undid in a few hours what they had accomplished in a month, and returned, leaving Aladdin alone in the hall. He took the lamp which he carried about him, robed up, and then the genie appeared. "Genie," said Aladdin, "I order thee to complete the 4th and 20th window." And immediately the window became perfect like the others. Scantly was the window complete before the Sultan arrived to question Aladdin as to why the jewels and goldsmith had desisted from their work. Aladdin received him at the door and conducted him directly to the hall, where he was amazed to see the window perfect like the rest. "My son," exclaimed the Sultan, embracing him, "what a man thou art to do all this in a twinkling of an eye. Verily, the more I know thee, the more I admire thee." And he returned to his palace content. After this, Aladdin lived in the great state. He visited Mazur, attended prayers, and returned to the visits of the principal lords of the court. Every time he went out, he caused 2 slaves who walked by his side of his horse, and he threw handfuls of money among the people, and he passed through the streets and the squares, and no one came to the palace gates to ask alms, but returned satisfied with his liberty, which gained him the love and blessings of the people. Aladdin, he conducted himself in this manner for several years, when the African magician became curious to know whether he had perished in the subterranean garden. He employed his magic arts to discover the truth, and he found that Aladdin, instead of having then perished miserably in the cave, he had made his escape and was living splendidly, and that he was in possession of the wonderful lamp, and he married the princess. The magician no sooner learned this than his face became inflamed with rage, and he cried out in his rage, "This miserable tailor's son has discovered the secret and the virtue of the lamp. I will, however, prevent his enjoying it any longer." The next morning he mounted a horse, set forth, and never stopped until he arrived at the capital of China, where he took up his residence at an inn. The next day he, accompanied by the means of the magic arts, and Aladdin was absent on the hunt, and that the lamp was in the palace, he then went to the coppersmith and bought dozens of copper lamps. These he had placed in a basket and went directly to Aladdin's palace. As he had approached, he began to cry out, "Who will change old lamps for new ones? Who will change old lamps for new ones?" And all who passed by thought him a madman or a fool to offer a change for new lamps for old. Now the princess Badroulbadour, who was in the hall with her 24 windows, heard the man crying, "Who will change old lamps for new ones?" And remembering the old lamp which Aladdin had laid upon a shelf before he went to the chase, the princess, who knew not the value of the lamp, commanded Eunuch, Urcha, I don't know, to take it and make the exchange. The Urcha did so, and the African magician, as soon as he saw the lamp, snatched it eagerly from his hand and gave him a new one in its place. The magician then hastened away until he reached a lonely spot in the country, when he pulled out the lamp out of his bosom and rubbed it. At that summoned the genie appeared, who said, what willest thou have? I am ready to obey thee and thy slaves, and the slaves of all those who hold the lamp in their hands. I and the other slaves of the lamp. I command thee, replied the magician, to transport me immediately to the palace which thou and the other slaves of the lamp have built in the city, with all the people in it, to Africa. The genie disappeared, and immediately the magician and the palace and all its inhabitants were lifted up and transported from the capital of China and set down in Africa. As soon as the Sultan arose the next morning, he went to the window to contemplate and admire Aladdin's palace. When he looked that way, instead of a palace, he saw an empty space. His amazement was so great that he remained for some time, turning his eyes towards the spot, and at last, convinced that no palace stood opposed his own, he returned to his apartment and ordered the Grand Vizier to be sent for. The Grand Vizier came with much proclamation. "Tell me," said the Sultan, "what has become of Aladdin's palace?" "His palace," explained the Vizier, "it is not in its usual place. Go to my window," answered the Sultan, "and tell me if thou canst see it." The Grand Vizier went to the window, where he was struck with no less amusement than the Sultan had been. "Well," said the Sultan, "hast thou seen Aladdin's palace?" "Alas," answered the Grand Vizier, "it has vanished completely. I have always thought that the edifice with which the object of thy admiration, with all the immense riches, was the work of magic and a magician." At these words the Sultan flew into a passion. "Where is that impostor, that wicked wretch?" cried he, "that I may have his head taken off immediately. Go thou bring him to me, loaded with chains." The Grand Vizier hastened to obey these orders and commanded a detachment of the horse to meet Aladdin returning from the chase, and to arrest him and bring him before the Sultan. The detachment persuaded their orders, and about 5 or 6 leagues from the city met Aladdin returning from the chase. Without explanation, they arrested him and fastened a heavy chain about his neck, and one about his body, and then both his arms, and pinned to his sides. In this state they carried him before the Sultan, who ordered him to be put to death immediately. But a multitude of people had followed Aladdin as he was led in chains to the city, and they threatened to riot if any harm should befall him. The Sultan, terrified at the masses, ordered the executioner to put up his scimitar, and to uphold and to unbind Aladdin. When Aladdin found himself at liberty, he turned towards the Sultan and said, "I know not what I have done to lose thy favor. Wilt thou not tell me what crime I have committed?" "Your crime, perceived wretch," answered the Sultan, "dost thou not know it? Where is thy palace?" What has become of the princess, my daughter?" Aladdin looked from the window, and perceiving the empty spot where his palace had stood, was thrown into such a confusion and amazement that he could not return one word of answer. At length, breaking the silence, he said, "I know not whither my palace had vanished, neither can I tell thee where it might be. Grant me but 40 days in which to make inquiry, and if at the end of that time I have not the success I wish, I will offer my hand and my foot to thy throne to be disposed of at thy pleasure." "Go," said the Sultan, "I give thee 40 days thou asked for. But if thou dost not find my daughter, thou shan't not escape my wrath. I will find thee out in whatsoever part of the world thou mayest conceal thyself, and I will cause thee head to be struck off." Aladdin went out of the Sultan's presence in great humiliation and filled with confusion. For 3 days he wandered about the city, making inquiries, but all in vain. He could find no trace of the vanished palace. At last he, wandering into the country, and at the approach of night, came to the banks of the river, where he sat down to rest. Clasping his hands in despair, he automatically rubbed the ring which the African magician had placed upon his finger before he went into the cave and down the steps to fetch the precious lamp. Immediately the same genie appeared whom he had seen in the cave where the magician had left him. "What willest thou have?" said the genie. "I am ready to obey thee and thy slaves, and the slaves of any who swears this ring, I and the other slaves of the ring." Aladdin, agreeably surprised at the appearance of the apparition he so little expected, replied, "Save my life, genie, by showing me the place where the palace I caused to be built now stands, or immediately transport it back where it first stood. What thou commandest is not in my power," answered the genie. "I am only the slave of the ring. Thou must address thyself to thy slave of the lamp." "If that be the case," replied Aladdin, "I command thee by the power of the ring to transport me to the spot where my palace stands, in what part of the world soever it may be, and set me down under. Here's some selling lamps, baby. The window of the Princess Barwal Borodo. These words were no sooner out of his mouth than the genie transported him into Africa, into the middle of a large plain where his palace stood, and placing him exactly under the window of the princess's apartment, he left him. The next morning, when the princess looked out her window, she perceived Aladdin sitting beneath it. Scantly believing her eyes, she opened the window and motioned to him to come up. Aladdin hastened to her apartment, and it is impossible to express the joy of both at seeing each other after so cruel a separation. After embracing and shedding tears of joy, they sat down, and Aladdin said, "I beg of thee, princess, but for thine own sake, and the Sultan thy father and mine, tell me what became of my old lamp, which I left upon the shelf in my robbing room, where I depart for my when I departed for my chase." "Alas, dear husband," answered the princess, "I was afraid our misfortune might be owing to that lamp, and what grieves me most is that I have been the cause of it." "Princess," replied Aladdin, "do not blame thyself, but tell me what has happened, and into whose hands it has fallen." The princess then related how she had changed the old lamp for a new one, and how the next morning she had found herself in an unknown country, which she was told was Africa by the tailor who had transported her hither by his magic arts. She also told how the wicked magician visited her daily, forcing upon her his unwanted attentions, and how he daily tried to persuade her to take him for a husband in the place of Aladdin, and added the princess, he carries the wonderful lamp carefully wrapped in his bosom. And this I can assure thee of, because I pulled it out before me, because he pulled it out before me and showed me in triumph. Princess, said Aladdin, this magician is a most profoundest wretch, and I have hence thee made to punish him, and to deliver thee from both thine enemy and mine. To accomplish this, thee must obey my directions most carefully. When the African magician came tonight, place the powder in his cup of wine. Offer him a cup, and he will esteem it so great a favor that he will not refuse, but will eagerly quaff it up. No sooner will he drink than thou wilt see him fall backwards. And the princess had agreed to the measures proposed by Aladdin. He took his leave. When the evening arrived, the magician came at the usual hour, and as soon as he was seated, the princess handed him a cup of wine, in which the powder had been dissolved. The magician reclined his head back to show his eagerness, drank the wine, and the very last drop, turned his eyes in his head, and fell on the floor dead. At a signal from the princess, Aladdin entered the hall, and he requested her to return immediately to her own apartment. When the princess, her woman, and enrichers were gone of the hall, Aladdin shut the door, and going to the magician, opened his vest, took out the lamp, which he was carefully wrapped up, and unfolded it and rubbed it. Whereupon the genie immediately appeared. Genie, said Aladdin, transport this palace immediately to China, to the place from whence it was brought hither. Immediately the palace was lifted up and transported to China. The morning of the return of Aladdin's palace, the Sultan stood at his window, absorbed in grief. He cast his eyes towards the spot where the palace had once stood, and which he now expected to find vacant. But in his surprise and amusement, there stood Aladdin's palace, in all its former grandeur. He immediately ordered a horse to be saddled and bridled and brought to him without delay, which he mounted that instant. Which he mounted that instant, thinking that he could not make haste enough to reach the palace. Aladdin received the Sultan at the foot of the gate staircase, helped him to dismount, and led him into the princess's apartment. The happy father embraced her with his face bathed with tears of joy, and the princess related to him all that had happened to her from the time the palace was transported to Africa to the death of the African magician. Aladdin ordered the magician's body to be removed, and in the meantime the Sultan commanded the drums, trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments of music to announce his joy to the public, and the festival of 10 days to proclaim for the return of the princess and Aladdin. Oh, that's it. Alright, baby. Tomorrow's going to be Little Lisa. I love you so incredibly much. You know that? I miss you so incredibly much. I can't wait to see you, honey. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to hold you. I can't wait to hug you. I can't wait to see you. I'll only hug if you want a hug. I mean, of course. I'll always ask you, but I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to see you. I really can't. I love you, baby. Let's do we sit and watch the rain as it falls from the sky. And we are glad to be inside where it is warm and dry. Oh yes, I do love the rain. It keeps the earth so clean and helps the pretty flowers grow from the mountains to the streams. Today is Friday, right? The 6th is Friday. And so it is Shabbos. So let's do Shabbat Shalom is the day of rest. Shabbat Shalom is the day we love best. Shabbat Shalom. Every Friday Eve I get that Shabbos glow. Shabbat Shalom is the day of rest. Shabbat Shalom is the day we love best. Shabbat Shalom. Alright, baby, let's do Lila Tov, honey. Lila Tov, and good night to you. Lila Tov, may your dreams come true. We sing Lila Tov, may Israel protect you throughout the night until we reach the morning light. I love you, I miss you, I can't wait to see you, baby. Like Papa always used to say, Mama's Papa's sun, Papa's my moon, and you're our rainbow baby, and we love you, baby. You're quite literally our rainbow baby, and we both love you. I love you, I miss you, I can't wait to see you, my baby.